They walked past him every single day. Not one person stopped to ask his name. Not one person saw the truth hidden beneath the worn uniform and tired eyes. But when the lawyer opened that envelope, everything they thought they knew shattered. He arrived before dawn, when the building still held the silence of sleep. His keys jangled softly as he unlocked the service entrance, a sound so familiar it had become part of the building's heartbeat. Thomas McCarthy, 67 years old. 23 years as the janitor of Riverside Corporate Center. 23 years of being invisible. The fluorescent lights flickered to life as he flipped the switches, casting harsh shadows across the marble lobby he'd mopped 1,000 times. His cart squeaked as he rolled it down the corridor, the same route he'd traveled for more than 2 decades. Left at the water fountain, right past the executive offices. Stop at the restrooms, clean, move forward, repeat. People would arrive in a few hours. The lawyers in their pressed suits, the executives with their leather briefcases, the young professionals clutching their coffee cups like lifelines. They would rush past him, their eyes sliding over him as if he were part of the furniture. Sometimes if they were in a particularly good mood, they might nod. But most days, Thomas McCarthy existed in a space between seen and unseen, acknowledged and ignored. He didn't mind. Not really. Or at least, that's what he told himself during the long hours when his knees ached from scrubbing floors, and his back protested every bend and lift. He had learned long ago that invisibility had its advantages. People said things around him they'd never say if they thought someone was really listening. Secrets spilled in hallways, confessions whispered near the coffee machine, dreams shared and forgotten in the same breath. Thomas had no family left. His wife Sarah had passed 11 years ago, her laugh and warmth taken by an illness that moved too fast for medicine to catch. They'd never had children. No siblings survived him. Just Thomas and his mop bucket, his squeaking cart, and the building that had become his entire world. His apartment was small, a studio on the 3rd floor of a building that had seen better decades. The rent was cheap because the landlord rarely fixed anything, and Thomas had learned to patch the holes himself, to live with the radiator that clanged through winter nights, to ignore the way the walls seemed to press in during the lonely evenings. He ate simple meals, watched old movies on a television he'd owned for 15 years, and went to bed early so he could wake before the sun and return to his post. But there was something people didn't know about Thomas McCarthy, something he carried with him every day as he pushed that cart down those endless corridors, a secret that lived behind his tired eyes and weathered face, a story that would have changed everything, if only someone had bothered to ask. Every morning, he would pause in front of the directory in the main lobby. His eyes would scan the names, stopping on one particular suite on the 14th floor, Whitmore and Associates. Harold Whitmore, senior partner. The name that connected to a past Thomas had locked away so tightly that sometimes even he forgot it was there. 40 years ago, Thomas McCarthy had been someone else. He'd worn different clothes, carried different dreams, walked through different doors. He'd been a young man with fire in his belly and plans that stretched beyond the horizon. He'd met Harold Whitmore at university, 2 boys from nothing trying to become something. They'd shared a dorm room, shared their futures, made promises the way young men do when they believe the world is theirs for the taking. Then, life happened. Choices were made. Paths diverged. Harold went to law school, married well, built an empire. Thomas made one mistake, trusted the wrong person, lost everything he'd scraped together. The details didn't matter anymore. What mattered was that Harold climbed while Thomas fell, and the distance between them grew until it became insurmountable. For 23 years, Thomas had worked in the building where his old friend rose to power. For 23 years, Harold Whitmore had walked past him without recognition. The boy who had once shared his last dollar, who had stayed up all night helping Thomas study, who had sworn they'd always be brothers, no longer saw him. Or perhaps he did see him but chose to look away. Thomas never knew which truth was worse. He never approached Harold. Pride, perhaps, or fear of rejection. Or maybe, deep down, Thomas understood that some distances couldn't be crossed. That the man in the expensive suit and the man with the mop bucket lived in different universes now, even when they shared the same building. So Thomas cleaned. He scrubbed. He emptied trash cans filled with the discarded dreams and careless waste of people who would never know his name. He listened to the building breathe, learned its moods, became part of its infrastructure. He was the man who made sure everything worked, even as he himself felt increasingly broken. The young professionals would sometimes complain about their lives within his earshot, never imagining he could hear or care. "I'm so stressed about this presentation. My bonus wasn't as big as I hoped. I don't know if I can afford the bigger apartment I wanted." Thomas would bite back the observations that rose in his throat. He wanted to tell them about real struggle, about losing everything, about the dignity found in simple work. But he remained silent, because that was his role, and he'd accepted it long ago. On his 67th birthday, Thomas celebrated alone in his apartment with a cupcake from the convenience store. No one at work knew it was his birthday. Why would they? The building's human resources department had his file somewhere, but he was just an employee number, a line item in a budget, a service provided. He sat on his worn couch and thought about Sarah, about the life they'd built from scraps, about how she'd always seen him when others looked away. "You're not invisible, Thomas," she used to say. "You're just waiting for the right moment to be seen." What moment? He'd wondered then and wondered still. What moment comes for a man like him? He didn't know that the moment was coming. He didn't know that everything was about to change. He couldn't see that the universe had been setting up this story for decades, arranging pieces on a board he didn't know existed. All Thomas knew was that tomorrow he would wake before dawn, return to his post, and continue being the man no one saw. The invisible man in the hallway, the janitor everyone ignored until his name was found in a $2 million will. It was a Tuesday morning, unremarkable in every way that mattered to the people rushing through the Riverside Corporate Center. The coffee was the same. The complaints were the same. The hurried footsteps echoing off marble floors created the same symphony of importance and urgency. Just another day in a building full of people convinced their problems were the center of the universe. Thomas was on the 7th floor, replacing light bulbs in the conference room, when he heard the commotion. Voices raised in surprise, maybe shock. The kind of disturbance that rippled through the professional calm like a stone thrown into still water. He paid it no mind at first. Buildings were full of small dramas. Someone spilled coffee on important documents. Someone missed a deadline. Someone said something they shouldn't have. None of it concerned him. But then the whispers started following him. He could feel eyes on his back as he moved through the corridors. People who had never looked at him before suddenly seemed to track his movements. Conversations stopped when he approached, then resumed in hushed tones after he passed. Something had shifted in the building's atmosphere, and somehow, impossibly, he was at the center of it. "That's him," he heard someone whisper near the elevators. "That's the janitor." Why were they talking about him? Thomas felt a flutter of anxiety in his chest. Had he done something wrong? Had he missed cleaning something important? Was he about to lose his job? At 67, with no family and barely any savings, losing this position would be catastrophic. His hands trembled slightly as he gripped his cart. Then he saw her, Margaret Chen, one of the senior partners from Whitmore and Associates, walking toward him with purposeful steps. She was a woman who commanded attention, always impeccably dressed, always moving with the confidence of someone who made important decisions before breakfast. She had walked past Thomas hundreds of times over the years. He'd emptied her trash, cleaned her office windows, restocked her bathroom supplies. She'd never once spoken to him directly. Now she was heading straight for him, and there was something in her expression that made Thomas's heart pound. "Mr. McCarthy?" Her voice was professional, but carried an undertone he couldn't identify. "Thomas McCarthy?" He nodded, unable to find his voice. No one here called him Mr. No one used his full name. "I need you to come with me, please. To the 14th floor, Mr. Whitmore's office, the 14th floor. Harold's domain." In 23 years, Thomas had cleaned that floor countless times, but had never been invited into the inner sanctum, the corner office where his old friend held court. Fear spiked through him. Was Harold finally going to confront him? Had he known all along that his old college roommate was the janitor, and now, for some reason, decided to have him removed? "Am I in trouble?" Thomas managed to ask, his voice rough from disuse. He wasn't used to speaking during work hours. Margaret's expression softened slightly. No, you're not in trouble, but we need to speak with you urgently. It's about Mr. Harold Whitmore. Is he all right?" The question came automatically. Despite everything, despite the years of silence, some part of Thomas still cared about the boy who had once been his brother. Margaret's face grew solemn. "That's what we need to discuss. Please come with me." The elevator ride to the 14th floor felt eternal. Thomas was acutely aware of his appearance. The janitor's uniform worn thin from too many washings, the scuff marks on his shoes, the way he smelled faintly of cleaning products. He was entering a world where he didn't belong, and everyone would know it. The doors opened to reveal a space he'd seen only in the early morning hours before anyone arrived. Now it was full of people, and the energy was strange, muted. Something had happened. Something big. Margaret led him past curious stares, past assistants who paused in their work to watch him pass. She opened the door to a large conference room, and inside, Thomas saw several people seated around an imposing wooden table. He recognized some of them. Other senior partners, the building manager, A woman in a dark suit he didn't know. "Please, sit down, Mr. McCarthy," Margaret said gently, gesturing to a chair. Thomas sat, feeling like a child called to the principal's office. His hands found each other in his lap, fingers twisting together. The woman in the dark suit leaned forward. She had kind eyes behind her professional demeanor. "Mr. McCarthy, my name is Linda Patterson. I'm an estate attorney. I'm very sorry to inform you that Harold Whitmore passed away 3 days ago. Heart attack. Very sudden. The world tilted. Harold was dead. The boy who had laughed at his jokes, who had dreamed with him about futures they'd build together, who had become a stranger wearing his friend's face, was gone." Thomas felt the loss hit him like a physical blow. All the more painful because he'd already lost Harold years ago. This was losing him twice. "I'm sorry," he whispered, and meant it. "Mr. McCarthy," Linda continued, "Mr. Whitmore's will was read yesterday. You're named in it." Thomas's head snapped up. "What? You're a primary beneficiary. He left you a substantial portion of his estate." The words made no sense. Thomas stared at her, waiting for the punchline, for someone to laugh and explain the mistake. "That's impossible. Harold and we haven't spoken in decades. He didn't even recognize me." Linda opened a leather folder and withdrew a document. "I have the will here. I'll read the relevant portion." She cleared her throat. "To my old friend Thomas McCarthy, currently employed at Riverside Corporate Center, I leave the sum of $2 million, my collection of first edition books, and my gratitude. Thomas, I saw you every day. I knew you were there. I was a coward who couldn't face the past, but I never stopped being your friend. I never stopped regretting the distance between us. This is my apology. This is my way of saying I'm sorry. Take this money and finally live the life you deserved. The life I should have helped you build." Silence filled the room. Thomas couldn't breathe. $2 million. Harold had known. All those years, all those past glances, Harold had known exactly who pushed that cart through his building. He'd seen Thomas after all. Tears began to roll down Thomas's weathered cheeks. He didn't try to stop them. The people in the room looked away, giving him privacy in his grief. "He saw me," Thomas said softly. "He always saw me." The news spread through Riverside Corporate Center like wildfire, and within hours, the entire building knew. The janitor, the invisible man who had mopped their floors and emptied their trash for more than 20 years, was a millionaire. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. People began looking at Thomas differently, and he hated it. Suddenly, everyone wanted to talk to him. People who had walked past him without a glance now stopped to offer condolences about Harold, to share stories, to suddenly remember that they'd always thought he was a good guy. The building manager appeared in person to tell Thomas he could take all the time he needed. "We're here for you," he said, with a warmth that had never existed before. Thomas wanted to ask where that warmth had been for the past 23 years. But Thomas didn't quit immediately. Despite the money, despite everything changing around him, he returned to work the next day. He needed time to think, to process, to understand what had happened. And truthfully, he wasn't sure who he was if he wasn't the janitor. The uniform had become his identity. Without it, what remained? In the days following the reading of the will, Thomas began learning things about Harold he'd never known. Linda Patterson provided him with documents, letters, and a journal Harold had kept. Alone in his apartment at night, Thomas read his old friend's words and discovered a story running parallel to his own. Harold had watched him for years. From the very first day Thomas was hired, Harold had known it was him. He'd recognized his old roommate despite the years, despite the changes life had carved into both their faces. But shame had frozen him. Shame about the success he'd achieved while Thomas struggled. Shame about the distance between them. Shame about not having the courage to cross the hallway and say, "I remember you. I remember us." In his journal, Harold wrote about the weight of guilt he carried. Every time he passed Thomas in the corridor, every time he pretended not to see him, the weight grew heavier. He wrote about wanting to reach out but not knowing how. How do you bridge a gap that wide? How do you explain decades of silence? So Harold had done what he knew how to do. He'd worked. He'd built his wealth with Thomas in mind, telling himself that one day he'd make it right. One day he'd find the courage. But days became years, and years became decades, and the courage never came. Only the money grew, and with it, Harold's determination that even if he couldn't fix the past, he could at least secure Thomas's future. Thomas discovered that Harold had been protecting him all along. Twice, budget cuts had threatened the janitorial positions at Riverside Corporate Center. Both times, Harold had personally intervened to ensure Thomas's job was safe. He'd paid for improvements to the building's service areas, better equipment for the maintenance staff, increased wages. He'd done it all quietly, never taking credit, never revealing his connection to the janitor everyone ignored. There were letters too. Letters Harold had written to Thomas but never sent. Hundreds of them, spanning decades, all collected in a box that Linda delivered to Thomas's apartment. Thomas sat on his worn couch and read them one by one, tears streaming down his face as he heard his friend's voice again. Dear Thomas, I saw you today near the water fountain. You were fixing a leak. You've always been good with your hands. I remember when you fixed our dorm room door junior year. We laughed so hard that night. Do you remember? I wanted to tell you I remember. I wanted to say something, but I just kept walking. I'm sorry. I'm always sorry. Dear Thomas, it's been 15 years since you started working here. 15 years of me being a coward. But I want you to know something. You're not invisible to me. I see you every day. I see the way you take pride in your work. I see the kindness in your eyes when you hold the door for someone who doesn't thank you. I see the good man you've always been. I wish I had your strength. Dear Thomas, I'm having my will updated today. You'll be taken care of. If I can't find the courage to face you while I'm alive, at least I can make sure you know the truth after I'm gone. You were always the better man. You were always the real success. I just had money. You had character. Thomas read until his eyes burned and his heart felt too full. He cried for the friendship they'd lost. He cried for the years Harold had suffered in silence. He cried for all the conversations they could have had, should have had, but never did. And he cried because, in some strange way, Harold had been reaching out all along, in the only way he knew how. People at work began treating Thomas like a celebrity. They wanted to hear his story, wanted to understand how he felt about the inheritance, wanted to be close to something extraordinary. But Thomas didn't feel extraordinary. He felt tired and sad and confused. He was 67 years old with $2 million and no idea what to do with it. Then, one afternoon, as he was cleaning the same conference room where he'd learned about the will, something clicked. He remembered Sarah's words. You're not invisible, Thomas. You're just waiting for the right moment to be seen. Maybe this was the moment. Not the money itself, but what the money could do. What he could do with it. Harold's letters had revealed something else. His old friend had filled them not just with regret, but with observations. For 23 years, Harold had watched Thomas move through the building, and he'd seen what Thomas saw. The young professionals struggling under student debt, the single mother who worked late every night trying to make ends meet, the elderly security guard who could barely afford his medications. Harold had noticed them all because Thomas had shown them kindness, had taken time to learn their names, had treated them like they mattered. You make people visible, Harold had written in one of his last letters. That's your gift, Thomas. You see everyone. You make them feel like they matter. I wish I had learned that from you when we were young. I wish I'd remembered it as I climbed. But I forgot what was important. You never did. Thomas stood in that conference room, mop in hand, and finally understood. The money wasn't just for him. It was a tool, a way to do what he'd always done, but on a scale that could actually change lives. He'd spent 23 years watching people, learning their struggles, seeing their humanity. Now he had the resources to help. But first, he needed to help himself. He needed to figure out who Thomas McCarthy was beyond the janitor's uniform. He needed to grieve for his friend, to process the gift he'd been given, to stand at the edge of his new life and decide which direction to walk. That evening, Thomas submitted his resignation. Not out of disrespect for the work, but because he finally understood that he had other work to do. Work that Harold had, in his silent way, been preparing him for all along. 3 months after Harold's death, Thomas McCarthy walked back into Riverside Corporate Center wearing clothes he'd never owned before. A well-tailored suit, proper shoes, the kind of watch that signaled success. But it wasn't the clothes that made people stare. It was the confidence in his shoulders, the clarity in his eyes, the way he moved through the building like he belonged in every space. He'd come back for a meeting, but not the kind anyone expected. Thomas had spent the last 3 months working with lawyers and financial advisors, not to figure out how to spend Harold's money on himself, but to build something that would honor his friend's memory and address the thing that had haunted Thomas for over 2 decades, the invisibility of ordinary people doing extraordinary work. He'd called the meeting for 2 o'clock on a Thursday. The conference room on the 14th floor, the same room where he'd learned about the inheritance, was now filled with people who had no idea why they'd been summoned. The building manager was there, looking nervous. Several executives from different companies in the building attended. Representatives from the janitorial company that employed the cleaning staff, the security team, the maintenance crew. Thomas stood at the head of the table, and for a moment he was transported back 40 years to a college classroom where he and Harold had presented their first business plan together. 2 kids who believed they could change the world. Life had taken them on different paths, But maybe, just maybe, they could still change something. "Thank you all for coming," Thomas began, his voice steady. "Most of you know me as the janitor who used to work here. Some of you might remember that I inherited a substantial amount of money from Harold Whitmore. I want to tell you what I'm doing with it." He pulled up a presentation on the screen. Not fancy, nothing like what the slick executives in the room could produce, but clear and heartfelt. This is the Whitmore McCarthy Foundation, named for two friends who lost their way but found it again. The foundation has a simple mission: to see the invisible. Thomas clicked to the next slide. "For 23 years, I watched this building function. I saw the people who make it work, the ones nobody notices until something goes wrong. The cleaners, the security guards, the maintenance staff, the people who arrive before dawn and leave after dark, who keep everything running so everyone else can do their jobs. They have dreams, they have struggles, they have families depending on them, but nobody sees them." He met the eyes of the building manager, who had the grace to look uncomfortable. "The foundation will provide scholarships for the children of service workers, education funding, medical assistance, emergency financial support for unexpected crises. But more than that, we're going to change how this building, and hopefully other buildings, treat the people who keep them running." Thomas clicked again. "Starting next month, Riverside Corporate Center will pilot a new program. Every service worker will receive a living wage increase, funded by the foundation for the first year. After that, we'll work with building management to ensure it's sustainable. Healthcare benefits will be expanded. There will be recognition programs, proper break rooms, opportunities for advancement. We're going to make sure that the people who make this building work are treated like the valuable team members they are." Someone in the room started to speak, probably to object to the cost, but Thomas held up his hand. "I'm not asking permission. I'm informing you of what's happening. I've already worked with legal counsel to ensure everything is above board. The funding is secured. This is going to happen." He softened slightly. "But I'm also asking for your partnership, because money alone won't change culture. That requires all of us choosing to see people we've been ignoring. It requires us to value work we've been taking for granted. It requires us to acknowledge that a person's worth isn't determined by their job title." Thomas shared stories then. He told them about Maria, the night cleaner who was putting 3 kids through school on her salary. About Robert, the security guard who'd worked 70-hour weeks to pay for his wife's cancer treatment. About Sophie, the young woman in maintenance who designed an efficiency improvement for the building's heating system, but had no way to share it because nobody asked for her input. He made them see the invisible people who'd been there all along. "Harold Whitmore was my friend," Thomas said quietly. "We lost our way. We let pride and shame and fear keep us apart. But in the end, he tried to do something good. He tried to make things right. This foundation is my way of continuing that work. This is my way of saying that every person matters. Every story deserves to be heard. Every human being deserves to be seen." The room was silent. Then slowly people began to nod. Some looked ashamed. Others looked inspired. The building manager stood and extended his hand to Thomas. "I'm in," he said simply. "Tell me what you need from us." Over the next months, the changes rippled through Riverside Corporate Center. But Thomas didn't stop there. He reached out to other buildings, other companies. He shared his story, and more importantly, he shared the stories of the people he'd worked alongside for 23 years. Media picked it up, not because of the money, but because of the message. Thomas became an advocate for invisible workers everywhere. He spoke at conferences. He wrote articles. He worked with labor organizations and corporate leaders to reimagine how we value different types of work. He was awkward at first, unused to being seen, uncomfortable with attention. But he persisted because he knew he was speaking for people who had no platform. The foundation grew beyond his initial vision. Other donors came forward, inspired by the story of the janitor and the lawyer who'd never stopped being friends. Scholarship programs expanded. Workplace reform initiatives spread to dozens of buildings across the region. Lives changed in tangible, measurable ways. But Thomas never forgot where he came from. Once a month, he returned to Riverside Corporate Center early in the morning, before anyone arrived. He'd walk the halls he used to clean, remembering. Sometimes he'd bring coffee for the new janitorial staff, sit with them on their breaks, listen to their stories. He made sure they knew they were seen. And every single time, he'd stop on the 14th floor, in front of what used to be Harold's office. He'd stand there for a moment, silent, remembering the boy who'd been his friend, the man who'd forgotten and then remembered, the final gift that had changed everything. "We did it," he'd whisper. "We finally changed something that mattered." Thomas had learned something profound, that true wealth wasn't measured in dollars. It was measured in dignity restored, in potential unleashed, in people who finally felt seen. Harold's $2 million was just money. But But what Thomas built with it, that was legacy. That was love. That was the friendship they should have had all along, finally bearing fruit. 2 years after receiving his inheritance, Thomas McCarthy stood in a renovated community center in a neighborhood where hope had been in short supply. The Whitmore McCarthy Foundation had purchased the abandoned building and transformed it into something magnificent. A training center, scholarship office, community gathering space, and memorial to a friendship that had survived despite everything trying to kill it. On the wall near the entrance hung 2 photographs. One showed Harold Whitmore in his prime. Successful, confident, every inch the powerful attorney. The other showed Thomas in his janitor's uniform, taken without his knowledge years ago by a security camera, catching him mid-laugh as he joked with someone off-screen. Beneath the photos, a plaque read, 2 paths, 1 friendship. The lesson, never stop seeing each other. Thomas had aged in the past 2 years, but he'd grown younger too, if that made sense. The weight he'd carried for decades had lifted. His shoulders were straighter. His smile came easier. He'd discovered that purpose was the best medicine for a tired soul. The foundation now operated in 17 cities. Over 3,000 service workers had received direct assistance. 42 children were attending college on full scholarships. Workplace conditions had improved in hundreds of buildings. But numbers, Thomas had learned, never told the whole story. The real story was in the letters he received. The mother who wrote to say her daughter was the first in their family to attend university. The security guard who'd been able to retire with dignity. The young janitor who'd used foundation support to become a teacher. Each letter was a life changed, a dream made possible, a person who'd been invisible finally seen. Thomas had also reconnected with his own story. He'd spent months in therapy, working through the grief and regret, learning to forgive himself for the years he'd spent hiding. He'd scattered Sarah's ashes in a place she'd always loved, finally giving himself permission to move forward while carrying her memory forward too. He'd started painting, something he'd loved as a young man but had abandoned when life got hard. His apartment, now significantly nicer but still modest, was filled with canvases showing ordinary people doing ordinary work, each painting a tribute to the invisible. He'd also learned things about Harold he wished he'd known sooner. Through conversations with Harold's colleagues and old friends, Thomas discovered that his friend had never married, had never had children, had poured himself into his work because he didn't know how to pour himself into life. Harold had been successful by every external measure but had died lonely, surrounded by respect but starved for genuine connection. "He talked about you sometimes," one of Harold's old partners told Thomas over coffee. Never directly, but he'd see someone do something kind, something genuine, and he'd get this look in his eyes. He'd say, "I knew someone like that once. Someone who never forgot how to be decent." "I think he was talking about you. I think you were always on his mind." The revelation had broken Thomas's heart and healed it simultaneously. They'd both been carrying each other all along, neither knowing the other remembered, neither brave enough to reach across the distance. But in the end, Harold had found his courage. In the end, love had won over fear. Today, the community center was hosting its grand opening. Hundreds of people filled the space. Service workers and their families, community leaders, journalists covering the story, representatives from companies that had partnered with the foundation. Thomas stood at a podium, looking out at faces that ranged from curious to grateful to inspired. "I'm not good at speeches," he began, and people laughed kindly. "I spent most of my life trying not to be noticed, but Harold Whitmore noticed me. Even when I thought he'd forgotten, even when I'd convinced myself I was invisible, he saw me. And in seeing me, he gave me the gift of seeing myself again." Thomas paused, gathering his thoughts. We live in a world that has very specific ideas about success. We measure it in money, in titles, in power, in status. And by those measures, Harold was tremendously successful. I was not. For 23 years, I believed that story. I believed that I'd failed and he'd succeeded, and the gap between us was my fault. But I was wrong. Success isn't about what you accumulate. It's about who you become. It's about whether you live with integrity. It's about how you treat people when nobody's watching. It's about the quiet dignity of doing your work well, whatever that work might be. By those measures, Harold and I were both successful, just in different ways. And when he finally understood that, when he saw that the janitor had something the lawyer lacked, he tried to tell me. He tried to say, "You were right all along. Your life had value. You mattered." Thomas's voice grew thick with emotion. "This center isn't really about a foundation. It's about a revolution in how we see each other. It's about refusing to let anyone be invisible. It's about recognizing that the person who cleans your office, who guards your building, who fixes your plumbing, who serves your coffee, is not less than you. They're you. We're all just people trying to survive, trying to find meaning, trying to matter. He looked directly at the camera recording the event. If you're watching this and you feel invisible, I want you to know something. You're not. Someone sees you. Maybe it's not obvious. Maybe they're too scared to say it. But you matter. Your work matters. Your story matters. Don't let anyone convince you otherwise. Don't spend decades believing you're less than you are. And if you're watching this, and you're the person walking past the invisible people every day, I want you to stop. Look at them. Learn their names. Thank them. Recognize their humanity. It costs you nothing and might mean everything to them. Don't be like Harold and me, losing decades because we were too proud or too scared to cross a hallway. Thomas smiled through his tears. My friend gave me $2 million, but the real gift was the reminder that I was worth seeing, that my life had value, that our friendship survived even when we thought it was dead. Money can buy a lot of things, but it can't buy back time. It can't undo regret. What it can do, if you use it right, is make sure other people don't make the same mistakes. It can build bridges. It can restore dignity. It can change the world one seen person at a time. So that's what this center represents. It's a bridge. It's Harold and me finally meeting in the middle, finally having the conversation we should have had decades ago. It's proof that it's never too late to do the right thing, to see clearly, to love better. This is our second chance, and we're not wasting it. The crowd rose to its feet, applause filling the space. Thomas stood there, overwhelmed, grateful, and more alive than he'd been in years. He thought about Sarah, about how proud she'd be. He thought about Harold, hoping his friend could somehow see this moment. He thought about all the invisible people who were about to become visible. All the lives that would change, all the stories that would be told. After the speeches, after the ceremonies, after most people had left, Thomas walked through the empty center alone. He ran his hands along the walls, imagining the futures that would be born here. He stood in front of the photographs of himself and Harold, two men who'd taken different roads but had somehow, impossibly, found their way back to each other. "Thank you," he whispered to the image of his friend. "Thank you for seeing me. Thank you for remembering. Thank you for giving me the chance to make sure nobody else feels invisible. This is for you. This is for us. This is for everyone who ever felt forgotten." Thomas McCarthy left the center that evening as the sun set, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose. He walked with the confidence of a man who knew exactly who he was and what he was meant to do. The janitor everyone ignored had become the advocate everyone listened to. The invisible man had become impossible to miss. But the most important transformation had nothing to do with money or recognition or fame. Thomas had learned to see himself the way Harold had always seen him, as someone who mattered, someone whose kindness was power, someone whose ordinary life was actually extraordinary. He'd learned that we're all invisible until someone chooses to see us. And once we're seen, truly seen, we have the power to help others be seen too. That's the real inheritance Harold left him. Not the money, but the reminder that every single person walking this earth deserves to be recognized, valued, and loved. The janitor had held a fortune all along, not in a bank account, but in his character. Harold's gift had simply revealed what was always true. Thomas McCarthy was rich in the things that actually matter. And now, because one man finally found the courage to say, "I see you," and another man finally found the courage to believe it, thousands of others would be seen too. The invisible would become visible. The forgotten would be remembered. The overlooked would be celebrated. That was the legacy that would live forever. Because in the end, the greatest wealth isn't found in what we possess. It's found in who we become when we choose to see each other. Harold and Thomas taught us that it's never too late to bridge the distance, to speak the truth, to honor the invisible people who make our world work. Their story didn't end with an inheritance. It began there. Now I want to hear your story. Who in your life deserves to be seen? Who have you been walking past without really looking? Tell me in the comments below. And if this story touched your heart, if it made you think differently about the people around you, subscribe to this channel. Because everyone has a story worth telling. Everyone deserves to be seen. And together, we can make sure no one stays invisible. The janitor who held a fortune in silence finally spoke, and the world listened. What will you do with what you heard?